Port Clinton Middle School. I'm going to be diving into a unit on natural selection today that I could use in my classroom in the future. Um, Eighth grade is really the time where natural selection is taught. In seventh grade, they start to talk about adaptations, but really going from adaptations to how mutations happen to overall natural selection is the next step. And that's what we talk about in eighth grade. So today, I'm going to talk about who my students are, some of the standards that this covers here in Ohio, some of my learning objectives, my main strategy behind why I'm teaching the lesson the way I am, some of the technology I'll be using. I'm going to go over 7 days worth of lessons. Each of my classes is about 43 minutes long, so keep that in mind. I'll go over some differentiation strategies, what my students will be able to access all online. We are a Google Classroom school, so I typically have some form of a digital um, materials for every single assignment that I do, because with COVID, we made that transition to needing online content. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about how I will be assessing my students throughout those 7 days and be assessing lesson effectiveness. So, a little bit about natural selection. We know the best traits are what helps us survive, and there's also limiting factors that play into natural selection as to what can limit a population from getting any bigger and so on. So let's get started. Let's talk about who my students are. Like I said, I'm an eighth grade science teacher. I have 6 classes of eighth grade science. There is only one eighth grade science teacher, so I do see all the eighth graders throughout the day. There's a picture of my classroom there. I have a very nice classroom, but we do come from a low income district. About 44.5% of Port Clinton Middle School is economically disadvantaged. My students are primarily white, African American, biracial, and I do not have any English language learners. They are all English speaking. They do come from a lot of different families. They come from broken homes, and we have really dove in the last few years of understanding how that affects our learners. Like I said, in 7th grade, they start talking about adaptations. And so that is where we're going to be building off of this. This is not a topic that's really started in 6th grade. I have 6 classes. One is a primarily IEP section. So most of them are on individualized education plans. And then I have a lower section. Those would be my bubble students who are not qualified to be on an individualized education plan, but do need a lot of modifications in order to help them understand at their level. Then I've got 2 middle sections, and then I have 2 higher performing sections of students, which with them I typically will do the same as my middle level, but if necessary, I will add in an extension if I'm going to be finishing early. All right, so the state standards. I'm not going to read these word for word, but essentially we need to understand, the goal of this is to understand that every single organism alive today, whether it's a plant, whether it's an animal, whether it's a human being, come from a long line of ancestors who somehow were able to reproduce successfully every single generation, hence why we have the organisms that we have today. We also need to understand that the specific characteristics of an organism are the result of inherited traits that they receive from their parents. They do not come from their friends. They don't come from some random animal. They don't come from some other human. They are coming from their parents. So here's my 5 learning objectives. Typically, I will use about an objective a day. Sometimes it turns out to be more or less than about a day. So I essentially just want to be able to see that students are able to identify mutations that are productive in their environment. I want students to understand how limiting factors contribute to their species, of their population of their species. We do need to understand the difference between a positive and negative and a neutral mutation. There are mutations that are harmless, that don't help species, and there's some that do hurt species. The goal, and we'll talk about this with the final assessment, is to be able to take a species that lives in our local community. We live on the coast of Lake Erie, so we have a lot of wildlife around us. So my goal is for students to be able to take a species that's specific to our local area and identify how natural selection works within their population. So I, being a science teacher, tend to like some form of a lab or an online lab or a simulation to really get my students interested in a topic and thinking hands on, figuring out how things work. So I decided to go with Brewer's approach to teaching this lesson. Um, Brewer's got about four main steps. One being we need to motivate students to be in order to motivate students, we have to get them interested in what we're learning. So that is something that a simulation like I'm going to show next is super beneficial in doing. So typically in that motivate stage, students are making predictions, they're getting interested in the topic that we're talking about, and that's a very repetitive process in science in general, especially because it is so problem based. So then the second step of Brewer is where students start to work together and solve problems, which is exactly what happens in simulations and labs. Typically, we have a question. In order, we start with that question. After we have a question, we make a hypothesis saying, this is what I think is going to happen if this happens. And next, and when we have to do the modeling, we have to essentially evaluate that hypothesis we made. We need to carry out procedures to see if we were correct. Then we go into a formalization phase. This is where students can use the scientific method. We're already through the hypothesis. We're now starting to draw conclusions and get to the goal of teaching the topic. So here we're going to be trying to be able to formalize the real definition of natural selection and how that applies to our lives. And then lastly, that transfer, I just kind of started to talk about that. We need to understand how natural selection works, but then we need to apply that to our lives. We're humans, so we're just like any other species. And then also being able to apply that to other species in the local area, like I said, for the final summative assessment. So, the main technology in this lesson is going to be a PhET simulation. You'll see to the right hand side, the top picture is showing where we're starting with only one rabbit in the population. Students will have to hit add mate, and then eventually that rabbit population just keeps multiplying. You'll see in the bottom picture that you can have rabbits with white fur, rabbits with floppy ears, rabbits with brown fur. There's all sorts of different types of populations we can be looking at, but you can also just look at the total population as you choose different mutations and environmental factors to introduce. Some additional forms of technology that you will see throughout this 7-day lesson is Google Forms. That's one of my favorite ways to assess. It's quick, it's easy, it gives instant feedback to me and the students. So it's a great exit ticket strategy. I will also be using Google Slides. This is a way I enjoy making those formalizations, having those key points, and I typically do some form of guided notes after we do a lab just to put some definitions to the paper, look at examples, and process them together. Google Docs I use all the time for a form of digital bell work. So we'll get into bell work here in a few minutes. And then AHA slides. Those are a great way to kick off a new unit to see where kids are in their current understanding of a topic. So day one, like I said, bell work. So essentially with bell work, they get on their Chromebooks. I'm going to have a slide on the smartboard, and they will have to write down the I can, which is my form of the learning objective, and they will answer a question. This question is just a baseline assessment of their present knowledge, where it is. They put the date, they're done with it. They do it every day, and that is part of their digital science journal, which is in Google Docs. So then we'll start with the aha slides, where we'll have just a general recollection of what we can remember from 7th grade and see if we can put any definitions to natural selection together. Then we will access the PhET simulation, which we'll talk about later, but some of the classes will be doing that in partners, some will be doing it individually. The first part of the PhET simulation is going to be filling out this handout that has predictions before they can go through and do the specific mutations and environmental factors that are addressed. So day one, the goal is to get through just about the predictions and maybe starting into the simulation. Day two, once again, we'll start with bell work. That's every single day. They'll get back with their partner if they were working the partner on the simulation. Then we will go into a whole class discussion once everyone is finished with the simulation. That whole class discussion is going to be imperative to making some formalizations about what's going on. And then we are going to do a Google Forms survey where they will be able to apply what they have learned to some different situations and answer questions about what they learned in the survey. That can be seen, a screenshot of that can be seen in the upper left-hand corner. Day three, once again, we'll start with bell work. After the bell work, that is when we're going to go over the exit ticket. That's an important thing that I have always done. Don't assign an exit ticket if you don't plan on going over the results, because students never get to learn from their mistakes in the exit ticket. It's a simple way of doing that. So then, with the last portion of class, after we have gone over the quiz from the day before, we'll do a little bit of teacher guided note taking. Again, this is some more formalization, writing down definitions, going through examples to once again review the concepts. Once they have those notes, they are able to go into filling out this graphic organizer, which I have screenshotted, with a few words like trait, adaptation, mutation, limiting factor, biotic, abiotic, and natural selection, where they're going to have to write the definition and add an example with a colored picture. This is their one-stop shop. I like to have a handout like this for every single topic that we study, because once it comes to error review for our state testing, this is a great thing to have. So day four, once we get done with the bell work, we are actually going to divide up into some groups. So I will have, depending on how many students are in the class, it'll be roughly 3 students per group. There will be a white fur rabbit population, a brown fur, a population with straight ears, a population with floppy ears, a population with short teeth, and a population with long teeth. The goal will be to play out these different scenarios where them as a population of rabbits, if I say there is now been a food shortage, how is their population going to be affected based on the traits that they have? And they need to make that decision. So some might die, they might get bigger, they might add to their population, and then as a group, their population needs to reflect what I introduced to them. We'll end the day with a Google Forms assessment over the vocab chart created the day before, just to see if our understanding of the words is progressing. The 5th day, again, we'll start with bell work. The 5th day is when we're going to start our 2-day long summative assessment. My class, love to do choice board assignments. I think everyone learns differently. In science class, it's really hard to express your knowledge in one set way. So I have created a choice board where they can either design a poster that could be hung around the school to talk about the species in our local area and how natural selection works within that species. They could write a letter to a politician or a stakeholder talking about the importance of preserving the lands around us where these animals live and the effects of natural selection on that. And then they could also make a slideshow presentation that could be shown at any school organization or a community organization to talk about how natural selection is working within our local area. Now, they will need to tell me exactly which choice they're going to be doing prior to starting. I like to see a class where not everyone's doing the same thing. So while I'm trying to play to learners' strengths, I do like to see a general mix within a class so that I know they aren't all doing the exact same thing. Um, this is something they can choose to work by themselves or with a partner based on what they chose to do for the simulation. Day 6, coming in, doing the same thing. They're going to be doing their bell work and finishing up their final assessment. Day 7, this is the last day. They will be in some form presenting their assignment to their peers. So if they wrote a letter, they're going to stand up, they're going to read that letter. I don't care if they never look up while reading that letter. So that's a great opportunity for kids who don't love to present because they don't even need to look at everyone. They just need to stand there and read. They could present their slideshow or they could talk about their poster. Pushing kids outside of their comfort zone to do hard things is a huge part of my class because it's science. We all make mistakes. Science isn't perfect, so I like to create that space. And to ensure that students are engaged in what their peers are presenting, I always have a 3-2-1 slip that they need to fill out over their classmates' presentations as we are going through the lesson. So a few of the ways I will be differentiating, one of the things I always do with like a Google form or any type of quick quiz, when it's multiple choice, I always automatically eliminate one answer so that they have the best chance of getting one of the answers correct out of the 3 that remain. Another thing that I plan to do, that I like to do with starting off a simulation or unit, is give them sentence starters for their predictions instead of just having them write the prediction themselves. As far as the assessment goes, I'll typically just put a little less weight on each of the points so that they are not tied to such stringent requirements. And with my 2 middle sections, I will assign pairs for the summative assessment, and they will just share their takeaways from the simulation and build, so they can share their takeaways and build off one another while they're doing that summative assessment. But for the simulation, it's important to note that they will be working by themselves. Whereas my IEP section, they will be assigned partners for the simulation and work on the summative assessment individually. The rest of the classes will get to pick. Some of the assistive technologies, Google Read and Write. Our school always uses Google Read and Write, so that will be available to them using the PhET simulation, taking notes, filling out the vocab, taking a Google Forms quiz, working on the summative assessment. The smartboard with a projector to amplify what I have on my computer screen so that all students can see. And I do have a student who is hard of hearing, so I will be using my microphone FM system during class. Here is an example of my online digital content. I always have something like this for roughly every unit just because this is a great place if I were to be absent due to an emergency or sickness. Students and staff will have access to this, and so will my substitute teacher. So they have all the materials they need. It's kind of a one-stop shop. This also lines up for me what I need to be posting in Google Classroom for my students. So I decided that this lesson is an example of a modification. This is where there's really a redesign to the task. And without using the specific PhET simulation that I chose, I would not be able to do some of the activities that I have chosen to do. So it really changed the whole way that I taught the subject. I was able to play out simulations in class then because of the PhET simulation, as well as provide opportunities for that formalization process and the transfer to be created talking about the local area and the species and the populations here. So without that simulation, there wouldn't have been the redesign, but there was because of it. The benefits of the simulation is that students can create meaning as many times as they need. They have access to it at all times. So they're able to go through it again and again from a different lens at different times of the day. So how will I be assessing my formative assessments? I had talked about using AHA slides. Those are going to be my preliminary assessments. I gauge my audience through whole class discussions. I'll have a couple of Google Form exit tickets between this after the simulation and the vocab, and then the playing out of the scenarios. That final summative assessment that'll take 2 days, this will be a large piece in understanding how kids are able to then make that transfer of understanding. I will be assessing the effectiveness of the unit design. One of the questions on my exit ticket says describe ways the simulation was limited. So I want kids thinking about how could this simulation be better? What did they not understand? What do they need more of in the simulation? Um, and then I'll collect some data from the summative assessment. If they were successful, then the way I taught it probably was effective. If they weren't successful and didn't understand, then it wasn't a successful unit. I will also have a 3-2-1 survey at the end of the unit just to see what they liked, what they learned from it. 2 things they're kind of still a little confused about, would like to learn more about, and 1 main question that they have following a 7-day unit. So this is how I plan to teach natural selection in about 7 days. It is fast paced, but gives kids opportunities to ask questions and reflect, and that is a huge piece in science. Thank you.